Tim Walz 10 Most Likely Questions. 1. Inflation and Economic Policy. Governor Walz. During the Trump administration, the average inflation rate was 1.9%, below the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Under the Biden administration, inflation has averaged 5.2%, peaking at 9.1% in June 2022. While it has been trending down, it is currently at 2.5%, still above the Fed's 2% target. How do you plan to tackle inflation moving forward? Why? Inflation is one of the most pressing issues for voters, affecting their daily lives. It's crucial to hear how Walz plans to address this continuing challenge too. Foreign policy in the Middle East. Governor Walz. Israel recently launched a ground offensive in Lebanon, escalating the conflict between Israel, Hezbollah, and Gaza. How do you plan to assist Vice President Harris in managing this crisis and preventing further regional instability? Why? The Middle East conflict is a pressing international issue, and Walz's response will help voters gauge his readiness to handle global crises. 3. Healthcare reform. As Vice President, what specific steps would you take to expand healthcare access and reduce costs for Americans, especially in light of the lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic? Why? Healthcare remains a critical issue for many voters, and Walz's perspective on expanding access and managing costs is crucial for understanding his domestic priorities. 4. Disaster preparedness and climate change. In light of the devastation from Hurricane Helene, what steps would your administration take to improve federal disaster response and mitigate the effects of climate change? Why? Given the increasing frequency of natural disasters, voters want to know how Walz would handle federal responses and policies related to climate resilience. 5. Education policy. Governor, as a former teacher, how would your administration improve public education, particularly regarding access and equity? Why? Walz's background as an educator gives him a unique perspective on education policy, which remains a significant issue for many American families. 6. Civil rights and policing. Given the civil unrest in Minnesota under your governorship, what reforms would you advocate for to improve policing and racial equity in the U.S.? Why? Walz's handling of civil unrest in Minnesota is a topic of interest, and voters will want to know how he plans to handle similar issues at a national level. 7. Immigration and refugee policy. What policies would you pursue to reform the immigration system and manage the current crisis at the southern border while also addressing the rights and needs of asylum seekers? Why? Immigration is a central issue, and Walz's plan for humane but effective immigration reform is something voters need clarity on. 8. Economic recovery post-pandemic. How do you plan to build on the economic recovery following the pandemic and ensure that the benefits are felt across all sectors of society? Why? Economic recovery is critical for many Americans who are still feeling the effects of the pandemic. Walz's plans for inclusive growth are crucial. 9. Infrastructure and jobs. With the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, how would you ensure that funds are used effectively to create jobs and improve infrastructure across the country? Why? Infrastructure and job creation are high priorities for voters, and Walz's stance on effective implementation is key. 10. Bipartisanship and national unity. How would you work to bridge the partisan divide in Washington and bring Americans together, especially on contentious issues like healthcare, climate change, and immigration? Why? Voters are tired of polarization, and Walz's ability to unite the country is a critical issue for many undecided voters. Tim Walz 10 Most Dangerous Questions. 1. Foreign policy and experience. Governor Walz, given your lack of direct foreign policy experience, how will you effectively support Vice President Harris in managing complex international conflicts, like the escalating war between Israel and Hezbollah? Why? Walz's limited foreign policy experience is a vulnerability, especially with rising tensions in the Middle East. 2. Handling inflation. Under the Biden administration, inflation has averaged 5.2%, significantly higher than the 1.9% under Trump. How do you justify the policies that have contributed to this inflation, and what specific steps will you take to address this going forward? Why? Inflation affects every voter's pocketbook, and Walz must defend the administration's policies while presenting a credible plan for the future. 3. Civil unrest in Minnesota. Critics have questioned your handling of the civil unrest in Minnesota. How would you address concerns about your leadership during these crises, and how would you prevent similar unrest on a national scale? Why? Walz's handling of civil unrest is a controversial topic, and his response could either solidify or weaken voter confidence. 4. Progressive versus moderate divide. How do you plan to balance the progressive wing of the Democratic Party with more moderate voters, especially when it comes to contentious issues like healthcare and immigration? Why? Walz must navigate the tension between progressives and moderates within his party, which could alienate parts of the Democratic base or independent voters. 5. Economic inequality. Despite economic recovery, many Americans feel left behind. What specific policies would you advocate for to reduce income inequality and ensure fair economic opportunities for all? Why? Economic inequality is a sensitive topic, and Walz will need to present clear solutions to a complex issue. 6. Pandemic response. Governor Walz, what mistakes were made during your handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how would you apply the lessons learned to future national crises? Why? While Walz may see his pandemic response as a strength, Some voters might view it as a vulnerability, particularly regarding economic shutdowns and healthcare access. 7. Police reform and crime. How do you plan to address rising crime rates while balancing the need for police reform and racial justice? Why? This is a divisive issue, and Walz will need to carefully address both sides without alienating key voter groups. 8. Balancing environmental and economic concerns. How do you plan to push forward on climate change initiatives while ensuring that workers in traditional energy sectors are not left behind? Why? Climate change is a priority for many Democrats, but balancing this with the needs of workers in energy sectors is a challenge. 9. Healthcare costs. Given rising healthcare costs, how would you ensure that expanding healthcare access does not exacerbate these cost issues for the average American? Why? Healthcare costs are a concern for many voters, and Walz must present a solution that addresses both access and affordability. 10. Immigration reform criticism. Critics argue that the Biden administration's handling of the border crisis has been ineffective. What would you do differently to address immigration issues while ensuring security and compassion? Why? Immigration remains a contentious issue, and Walz's response needs to strike a balance between security and humanitarian considerations. This list presents questions that will likely come up and those that could challenge Tim Walz's core strengths and vulnerabilities. By presenting clear and fact-checked data, the moderators can foster a debate that is both informed and pressing, ensuring voters gain a clear understanding of Walz's readiness for the vice presidency.